Hi, and welcome to the board. I'm Kirsten Donaldson, Agile Coach at Boost, and this is Paul Flewelling.
Also an Agile Coach at
also
Boost.
An Agile Coach. Welcome back, Paul. Paul's been on somewhat of a world tour for the last 5 weeks.
Yep.
Do you want to tell us where you've been?
As Kirsten said, a world tour. So I started in Canada and the States for some training. I was on a Scaled Agile Framework program consultant training course. And then I flew on to Europe and the UK.
Hi, welcome to the board.
And
Yes, again.
I got to see my family, who I haven't seen for a few years, and go and visit Turkey. And then I stopped in Shanghai on the way back to see the guys that work in our Agile office in Shanghai.
Boost Agile.
Yeah, Boost Agile. Yep.
So how does it feel to be back in windy and wet Wellington?
Yep. I'm really happy to be back. Yeah. I think I was missing my own bed. That's the
right. Well, it's nice to know you've missed work as well. So.
I miss work as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Scaled Agile Framework, there was 40 people on that course, and they're all there was a good mix of people, mostly internal consultants in this case. Lots of big companies in the States are implementing the Scaled Agile Framework at the moment. Seattle, where I was for the training, is the home of Boeing, and not surprisingly there were 15 people from Boeing on the course, but they were also from all over the States. In terms of they were in Seattle, they have the airline division, but there was also people there from their space division and their military division as well.
Oh, it's got some interesting people then.
Some really interesting people, really smart people, and working on massive projects, like projects such as the F-22, which is a fighter,
kind of plane.
A plane, yeah. Imagine, and just it blew my mind in terms of the scale of the project. There's thousands of people involved in a project like that. It's hardware and software, obviously, all kinds of different control systems. Special tools being built, special software being written to build the plane itself, rather than just and so on.
So what software being written for machines to build parts?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so it's a pretty unique environment, I think, anyway, in that kind of company.
And they're actually working with Scaled Agile Framework now.
They are. They're
deliver that?
They're implementing it across the company, and they have Scrum teams working operating at the lower tier, and then they're gradually converting their program and portfolio layers to scaled approach.
It'll be really interesting to hear them talk about it once they're a bit further along and talking about their journey. But I guess they're not going to come to New Zealand. But
no, and
maybe they'll do something online.
I'm in contact with a few of those guys, so hopefully via LinkedIn. So I will remain in contact. There was also people there from HP and Intel and Microsoft. There's a lot of interest in the Scaled Agile Framework at the moment, and a lot of companies in the States, like I say, are implementing it. It seems to be the best alternative when you're operating agile at scale.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we've been talking to people in the New Zealand government about here, which could be quite well suited to the larger government departments as well.
Yeah.
And it's something we'll continue to talk to people about, and
that's right.
Try and encourage them, see how they might find that it will work for them.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it does. I mean, I've worked in government here. And they do things in a very similar way here. It's perfectly feasible to. I mean, Scaled Agile talks in terms of agile release trains, and an agile release train looks after one of your products, and then you have an agile release train is between 50 to 150 people, but there's different ways of skinning cats and so on, and you can have depending on how you see your program, you normally have different products contributing to a wider program, so you can have different teams working on different products and call it one agile release train and so on. You're just synchronizing your activity, mapping your dependencies across teams and so on. And then obviously at the portfolio level, you're doing pretty much what you do day to day now, but you're using a Kanban system to make work visible at that level, so that it's just about making work visible, understanding what is coming next, so that the teams or the the program management team below can have high visibility of what's on the horizon, if you like.
Yep.
So it very similar to what those government departments are doing right now, just a bit more visibility, a bit more transparency,
a bit more agile,
a bit more. Well, if that's what agile is, transparency.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's part of it, isn't it?
And collaboration.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a couple of things that we've talking about today.
Yep.
So one of them, which probably leads on quite nicely from talking about SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework, is something that came up when we were chatting with a few people yesterday about working with two teams who are working off one backlog.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So I mean, in Scaled Agile Framework, there is one backlog, isn't there, amongst all the teams?
That's right. There's a so it's the program backlog, which feeds into the team's backlogs. But and so that each team has its own product backlog, if you like. It's a bit, but it's much the boundary lines are much grayer and or ill-defined in the scaled approach. So because obviously teams could be working on, for example, the example we were talking yesterday about was one team working on the API, the other team working on a front-end system which implements that API, and about managing the dependencies, because obviously it's a chicken and egg scenario. I mean, you could, in theory, as long as you know what the interfaces are and so on, you could build a front end before you've got the API, and you could just mock the environment so that you can test it and so on.
Yeah.
But you just accept the fact that changes are going to come through from the API team at some point, and so on.
But listening to that, Lisa, did you think there were some opportunities to have those two teams work together more?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's what I saw with the scaled approach, is that you actually you don't try and do things the hard way. You try and let the teams work in a more natural flow where they decide how they're going to implement. They map out their dependencies. They work out how they're going to work together at that level. Essentially, it's up to the team how they decide to implement.
Sure. But, I mean, I was actually thinking though, it's two teams. One's doing, say, API and one's doing front end.
Yeah.
Would it not be better if they kind of mixed up those stories so that both teams are doing some API and both teams are doing some front end, so that you've got stories that involve API work with front end in the same story? Yeah. Is that possible, or
that is possible? But
I
think it is possible, but it honestly depends on the scale. And
right.
I know some situations where there'll be a dedicated team to the API because it's just too big,
right.
or just too much domain knowledge for that. And you're once you start to, Scrum teams should be 5 to 9 people.
Yep.
Once you start breaking those boundaries, then it gets a bit quite hard to manage.
Yeah, no, I mean still maintaining the two teams, but
you mean this?
But just slicing up the stories differently.
So okay.
So that the stories contain a whole feature from back end to front end, rather than split it into front end stories and API stories.
Yeah.
And then each team could work on those stories that are sliced slightly differently.
I mean, that's possible. I mean, we do that here.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing, and I just thought that way, because otherwise, the project we were talking about yesterday seemed to me to be becoming one of those handoff projects. So as was described, there's a back-end team, a front-end team, and a testing team. Yeah. So you're still having that passed off rather than having a slice of functionality
that's
in
right.
a story.
And
so you're ending up with stuff unfinished.
I mean, let's be really clear. I prefer what you're describing, without doubt. It's just that some teams operate in this component way. They build components, and unfortunately, the component approach doesn't really lend itself to. Those teams find it really hard to go vertical in terms of their slice.
But the problem is they're not going to achieve the productivity.
No, I don't think
that people who had those slices of functionality through stories can achieve.
That's right.
In terms of working software that can be as a value to the business and to the end user. And
that's right. And I think if the project scale allows it, then I think you should work in vertical slices, and you should get as much knowledge across all of the teams about the complete depth or complete slice of the system. So you're looking at total depth of the system. When you move into something much bigger, then it becomes a bit harder to manage, and you can't, those niceties sort of fall by the wayside because you don't have to build.
Sure. I think the idea though of having an entire team working on testing seems dangerous. In terms of not getting things finished.
That's a red flag for me.
Yeah. So I would at least expect there to be testers within each
Yep.
those teams,
That's
the back-end
right.
team and the front-end team.
Definitely.
You know, working with developers or being the developers.
If you've got a separate test team, then it just immediately red flag, because that's a cost of delay right there. Because you have to hand off the work once it's been finished. You're handing it over to the test team.
Yeah, and then, you know, a lot is going to come back, right?
Yeah, that's right, because the test team's got multiple teams feeding into it. If that's the setup you've got, you know, that's the scenario I can see. You've got one test team, multiple development teams, all throwing things over the fence to the test team.
Yeah.
They can only manage one project at a time or whatever, you know, they can't do multiple things at once.
Yeah.
And so there'll be a delay in getting it.
I mean, it's the same. Actually, similarly, we were talking to someone yesterday who was talking about how to share UX resource over a couple of teams.
That's right.
But what we came around to was us, the UX person and the team, how they'd like to share, because it's one of those situations where it really needs to work for all of those people, not for Scrum Masters. It's really nothing to do with us.
That's right. There's a really good book called The Principles of Product Development Flow by Don Reinhartson, and he talks about the key metric that you have to measure and analyse is your cost of delay. That's the key thing. Yeah. And so if there's a delay in that UX resource being available, you have to measure the cost of that delay and work out whether it's acceptable to the organisation or not. And if it's not acceptable, then you have to do something differently.
Yeah, I think because the other option we were talking about was like, do you perhaps need more UX resource? You know, sometimes it does come down to that. If it can't be resolved by the team and by UX resource, then, you know, maybe you need to think.
Yeah.
But I mean, the problem with a smaller company, I know with ours, is that, you know, sometimes work ebbs and flows. So it can be difficult to.
That's right. There's a balance.
You know, have resource all the time. So it is a balance. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why the cost of delay is so important. If you know, if the cost of delay is, you can absorb it in the cost of the project, then that's fine. If you can't absorb it, if it's becoming too big, then you have to do something.
Because you've got to weigh it up against those periods where things have ebbed. You know, and see what's going to be worth it. That
might mean you hire a contractor.
Yeah. True.
That kind of thing. You know.
Yeah. Exactly. So what else we got here? Something else that came up yesterday from one of our team members was working with smaller Scrum teams as a Scrum Master. I know I've worked with a number of smaller teams here at Boost as a Scrum Master, and I did find myself being someone who offered and was asked opinions on the project quite a lot, because, you know, if you're working with, quite often it was just one developer and one designer, and they really needed someone else to kick things off against, you know, just to discuss things with. It's a little bit harder in a smaller team to talk about solutions when there's just two of you. But what Joe, who's the person that brought this up, was saying is, you know, is this appropriate for a Scrum Master to get that involved? Because it is very tricky in a small team.
Yeah, I mean, small teams, I mean, when you go outside of the Scrum definition of team of 5 to 9, it does have its own difficulties or you know, dynamics that you have to manage. And one of those is, like you're saying, when you've only got one developer or one designer, so 2 members of the team, they're really limited to the ideas, sharing and so on, and they don't have backup, they don't have support in terms of, and they don't have all of the answers, you know, because they're just effectively a 1-man, 2-man team. You know.
I think one of the things we did actually on one of the teams I worked with that was mainly just one developer working on it, when we saw that he was suffering from a lack of that team environment, we put him in touch with a developer from another team, which was actually you at the time, to bounce ideas off, because we could see that he didn't have that and he was really struggling. I think that helped. Do you remember a little while ago when we did that? It does. Yeah. It does really help. It's much better than that person struggling through on their own in terms of trying to get the answer. It's much better to be able to share those ideas. It just requires a bit of investment from the outside team member, because if they're not invested in what you're doing, then they often give they can have a superficial view of the problem, and then they end up giving you ideas that take you down the wrong track, for example. It's so the person that, if you do have an outsider involved, they have to be invested in the project as much as they can be, you know. I found as a Scrum Master on a smaller team, I ended up working as part of the team as well. So for stories that involved user testing, for example, I'd often get involved. So I kind of found myself being a strategy resource quite often.
Yeah.
So then I did have buy into the project, not just as a facilitator, but also as a team member.
Yeah.
And that tended to work quite well. I think participating in stories makes it easier to be that sounding board.
Yeah, that's right. And it can, because I'm a former developer, I'm a good sounding board for the having worked in Scrum teams. I can see that I can encourage people to take certain directions.
Well, I
in terms
mean,
of
actually, because
how they
there was
break down
another
working
wee
stories.
project recently where you were technical coach.
Yeah, that's right.
Because actually there's a newer member of Boost that
Yeah.
was involved, and we wanted to give him some support
Yeah.
on that.
What I have to make clear to project teams that I work with like that is that I'm not an authority,
Yeah.
and they shouldn't be listening to my.
Well, yeah, you're not telling them what to do. You're helping them discuss
That's right.
ideas.
That's right.
Yeah, and I suppose it is good to make that clear. Otherwise, they might be confused and think, "Oh, I'll just do it that way."
Yeah. And that's the last thing you want. That's one of the things that Scrum is trying to prevent from happening. Is people telling, people that don't have the knowledge, telling people that do have the knowledge what to do.
Yeah. It's funny, I mean, in this conversation today, we've gone from the opposite ends of the scale. So we've got that massive enterprise
That's right.
scaled agile framework, and then we've got,
Yep.
smaller teams in a place like New Zealand
Yep.
where, there are a lot of small to medium businesses
Yep.
that deal with the challenges we're talking about now.
That's right. And I think Scrum does work at those
Both.
at the smaller level as well, really well.
Absolutely. I mean, we've been doing it for a number of years now, and
Yeah.
have definitely found it to be much more successful than previous ways of working.
That's right, and the gains you get from using the Scrum approach far outweigh the disadvantages.
Challenges.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and even the challenges make it interesting,
Yeah, that's right.
trying to find a way to make it work. And
Yeah.
as long as we keep improving and on what we've been doing previously, which I think we still are,
Yeah,
then it's all good.
that's right.
So what else have we got today? Distributed Scrum teams we were talking about yesterday during a meetup as well.
That's right.
So there were some interesting things coming out. I think the most challenging thing that we find when we talk about distributed teams is time zones.
Yeah, exactly.
Not so much like, Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, more UK, China, US.
That's right. So there's plenty of tools available to manage the communication over distance, like Skype, for example.
There is. I mean, it doesn't usually come down to a problem with tools, though, does it?
It's not a problem with the tools, no. It's exactly as what you just said, the time zone. So in the time zones, the hardest as I've found was when I was in the UK. And at the moment, the UK is 13-hour time difference.
It's impossible, isn't it? It's not just that it's hard to get hold of people at the right times. It's that you're in a completely different mind frame at each end. One person's sleepy about to go to bed, the other person's just got up, is ready to face the day, or vice versa.
Yeah, that's right.
And it just feels really different talking to each other.
Yeah.
But you were telling me yesterday that we're going to be doing some strategy work with our Chinese arm soon, and that you're going to work to their day.
That's right. So that's what they've asked. They've asked us if we'll start. So their day would start at 8 a.m., which is 1 o'clock our time, 1 p.m. our time, and so we're going to start at 1 p.m. and we'll go through till 10 o'clock at night.
Which is the only way around it would really work, because if we worked to our day, they'd have to get up before they went to bed, basically.
They'd be 5 hours time difference, so they'd be getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, so it just doesn't work.
Or 4 o'clock in the morning.
Whereas 1 till 10 is okay.
Yeah, 1 to 10. I mean, at least it's still, we wouldn't be asleep at. Well, might be asleep.
Well, you won't be because you'll be working.
That's right. But
it's
not a big time
shift.
shift. It's not a big time shift, whereas 4 a.m. in the morning is. And apparently we did. The point is that it's open to negotiation, and we could shift those time zones. So if they wanted to, if we next time we did this meeting, we wanted to, say no, we'll have a normal day for ourselves. You guys have got to get up at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning. Then there's no reason. It's not a huge, shift.
Yeah, I wouldn't be getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to join some of this time. So I just wouldn't. I feel physically ill if I get up that early.
I'm more of a morning riser, so
I'm a morning person, but that's not morning. That's middle of the night.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's quite interesting. I'd be interested to hear how that works out for you working on the China time zone.
I mean, it's the reality of living in New Zealand. We do, especially if you want to tune into webinars in the States. you have to get up early to. It's early in the morning or nothing.
Yeah, or just don't watch it live.
Yeah, that's the other thing.
Yeah, always behind. We're actually in front though, aren't we? We do see the day first.
That's
Unfortunately,
right.
the rest of the world's behind us. So.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what else we got? There's something that you were talking about yesterday, I think, was how do you have a team recognise that they can still make improvements?
Oh yeah, this is an interesting one. So the team has got to a point where they've plateaued, and they're usually high performing, or they're much, that's the general pattern with a Scrum team is they form, storm, norm.
Form, norm, storm.
Is that the three?
Forming, norming, storming.
Yeah. So that they've normed, and they're suddenly that norming, because they were on such a storm, that on an increase in productivity. Suddenly the norming feels like they're not.
Norming is third,
They're not making any more progress. They've plateaued in terms of their increase in productivity, and often the teams will come to you and say, we don't feel like we're being productive, or we want to increase our productivity, or they might even just say, well, we're already high performing enough. We're high performing, so let's just.
So what happens in a retrospective when a team believes they've gone as far as they can go? Do they just not come up with any issues?
They keep coming up with the same issues, and then they feel like they can't deal with them. So they've seen that issue before.
They just put it in too hard file.
And so for a Scrum Master, or at that point, your job is to use different techniques to try and flesh out what those issues are and whether they are. I mean, if they're non-issue, then if it's a non-issue, then I'd say there's probably no point in wasting time trying to go deeper. But if you feel like it is an issue that needs to go deeper on, then you need to find different approaches to getting the team to tackle that idea and
a bit further.
Yeah.
So, for example, you could do a root cause analysis,
that
5
kind of thing,
whys.
5 whys, or
to get,
or the fishbone analysis.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Anything that goes into the root cause. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're both in
the other one.
Esther Darby's book.
That's right. And the other one, the
retrospectives book.
Force field analysis is the other good
that's in
root
Esther
cause
Darby's book as well.
That's right.
Yeah.
They're really good techniques. So yeah, that's the thing with the team that believe they've got as high performing as they will go, is that you have to remind them that Kaizen, which is one of the agile principles, is not the agile principle, sorry, but is an underlying philosophy of all agile, is that Kaizen is a continuous improvement, and if you believe that you've if you've reached the peak of your performance, then you're not really applying the principles of Kaizen or continuous improvement. You're resting on your laurels. And so then the next thing I think is to try and encourage the team to look at what they're doing and understand that there's always room for improvement in my mind. We, for example, with a team recently, they highlighted that they thought flow was their big issue. They'd got to a point where they understood Scrum. They had Scrum working really well, but they couldn't work out why some of their sprints were better than others. Sometimes they had a very high velocity. Sometimes they had a low velocity and lots of stories carrying over into the next sprint.
So there wasn't a consistency.
There wasn't a consistency. Yeah, the flow wasn't there, and so they really focused on their flow. And we use a number of different tools to analyse their flow. One of those being the cumulative flow diagram.
Yeah.
But basically, you're just analysing your cues and where things are getting delayed, whether it's in the preparation for a story, or when the story is being worked on, or waiting for acceptance or testing, or and so on. You're just analysing each point in your process and saying what's the delay, which cue is backing up.
Things up.
Yeah. And so we did that, and those guys reduced. As a result of that, they analysed what they were doing, and they reduced the size of their stories, which is one of the principles of Kanban, to reduce small batch size, reduce your unit of work,
to increase productivity.
And to increase productivity, because it reduces variability and increases
productivity. Yeah.
Increases workflow.
Yeah.
So that team, that was like I said, that team was already quite high performing.
Yes.
But they recognised that they had some issues that they had to deal with.
Mm.
All teams I've spoken to have got issues that they're productive, high performing teams. It's a shame that they've got to the point in this whether they feel like there's issues that they can't deal with. It's outside of their remit. It's not possible to address that issue. It's a wider organisation issue, which is when the Scrum Master or the Agile coach really comes in. It's their job to unblock, and go to work. So those issues are the meaty bits. They're the ones that that's the time that Agile coach actually has a.
Which brings me on to another issue we were talking about yesterday, which is how prescriptive should Scrum Masters be with the Scrum process. I think, firstly, it's quite obvious that if you're working with a new team, you should, lay out how it works, which you might call prescriptive, but it's slightly wrong word, I think.
Yeah.
You need to teach them when the meetings are, what the meetings are, why the meetings are, and ideas like making stories small, how to do sizing and things like that. But I guess what we're talking about is, as teams get more used to the process, how rigid should we be about enforcing process?
It's a good question, and it comes up fairly regularly for me in terms of a team wants to change something within Scrum, and do we need to size our stories anymore, for example?
Right, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the coach's job then is to ask them why they don't want to size stories, what they think, is to understand what is pushing their desire to not size stories. And if they understand the principles well enough, then I don't see why you can't stop sizing stories. If the reality is that you've got all of your stories down to similar sizes, and they're all, for example, 2 or 3 points in size, and there's no variation in that, you've reduced your unit of work to similar sizes, then why size your stories?
I guess that's true. Sorry, I thought we just lost the service a little bit here. We're doing a little bit of buffering, but distracting me. I guess that's right. And have you had a team recently that wanted to stop sizing stories?
That's right.
Have they stopped sizing?
No, they haven't.
But they had a good chat about it.
They had a good chat. They realised there was lots of they've had new team members join, so that they realised that story points are still an important part of the conversation. They really trigger that conversation around how big a story, what's involved with completing a story.
But I guess, like, letting them decide for themselves, and if they had decided not to size stories anymore, that's really part of something we've discussed before about breaking the rules, isn't it? Is it Shuhari that we've...
Shuhari, yeah, that's right.
So
the first stage is follow the rules.
Yeah.
Second stage is bending the rules. Third stage is writing the rules.
Yeah. So, I guess it's a bit of second and third stage there, bending and writing the rules. And if it works, it works. Particularly with a very well-established team.
That's right.
And it is interesting that they had taken into account the new members of the team and decided actually we're going to stay with the way it is at the moment. Yeah. So there may be time in the future if that team stays fairly static in terms of members where they revisit that idea. Yeah.
That's right. I think it's this coach's job to analyze, to talk to the team and work out if they understand the underlying principles, the agile principles that they and if they do, then there's no reason why you can't have that discussion about changing the rule. Yeah,
as opposed to just going and say, oh no, you can't do that because this is absolutely something we must do in this process every single time.
But very early on though, the usual things that crop up is, I don't see the value in stand-ups, why do we bother with stand-ups? I don't see the value with retrospectives, why let's not do retrospectives.
Yeah, and I'll go back to the story that I've repeated before on here, when a team I was working with, an internal team on an internal product, decided to make a change in regards to the retrospectives, which was they didn't want the product owner coming to the retrospectives anymore. So he didn't attend. But what he found was that the team was coming up to him during the course of the sprint to raise things that would normally come up in the retrospective. Yeah. So he rejoined. But the point being there is that teams still decided, but they had to discover for themselves why that wasn't working.
That's right.
It wasn't like me as the Scrum Master said, oh well, you can't exclude the product owner from this meeting, it's not the done thing. I said, fine, let's see how that works out.
And so it's a really tricky situation when a team that's new to Scrum comes up to you and says, we don't want retrospectives, or we want to change the retrospective. I mean, and what do you do in that? I would say you would. There's two schools of thought, isn't there? You know, either we drop the retrospectives and the team work out for themselves. But if they haven't got that much experience with retrospectives, then they probably haven't seen the value of the retrospective in the first place.
Yeah, it's tricky.
And so, then do you just push them through to make them see the value of the retrospective? Do you find different ways of running the retrospectives? Do you allow them to run their own retrospectives, for example?
I would, you know, in that situation, I'd personally say, well, let's persevere with another couple and then revisit the idea so that you can get a taste for how they work.
Yeah.
You know, it's a compromise for a new team.
Joe does a great thing. Joe is behind the camera at the moment, so you guys can't see him, but he does something called opposite day, which is something they have in the States, where they describe the complete opposite of how they're feeling.
What the actual situation is,
And there's quite a good technique for, it's called reverse brainstorming or something like that, where you're, instead of brainstorming how an idea would look, you brainstorm how it wouldn't look, or you brainstorm.
So, for example, if you weren't finding that the retrospectives were valuable, you might say something like, I'm finding retrospectives really valuable at the moment.
Well, you could, so say the team suggests no longer running retrospectives. You could reverse brainstorm and say, what would it look like if we didn't run retrospectives?
Okay.
Instead of saying what are the value in retrospectives, what is the value in not running the retrospective? That kind of thing. It just sees things from a different angle. It's another Esther Darby technique. I'm probably paraphrasing and misquoting the technique, but it's something that I found quite useful in my retrospectives when people are stuck on fixing an idea or trying to work out how to resolve a problem they've got. Often reverse brainstorming helps.
I think we're having problems with the stream at the moment. It keeps buffering, so we might wrap it up for today anyway, given it's 11 o'clock.
Sure.
So thanks for joining us, those of you who did join us, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
And please, if you've got any ideas for things that you'd like to see on future shows, please get in contact with us.
Very happy to discuss anything you'd like to talk about.
We actually would love more audience participation, so we're looking for your questions, please. Thank you.
Thanks.